Worldview talks to the European delegation, and we're here with Ambassador Ronald van der Geer to help us just understand some of the questions that have been perceived in the media. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
You're welcome. Now we'll start right away. I'll start talking about African aid from the European Union, which is, it really has been, African countries have really been looking forward so much to aid from the European Union. Now, aid slips down priority list for cash-strapped traditional donor countries, that is. But emerging powers say they can afford to help. I'm talking about Turkey and South Korea nations that have watched their own fortunes surge in a generation. And they are ramping up aid programs for poor nations at a time when such spending in Europe is under threat, and that's according to statistics. Now, how viable is that for the EU as a whole?
Well, let me say in the first place that it is projected for European aid from European institutions to go up very considerably over the coming 7 years by some 30% corrected for inflation. So in fact we are planning a rather massive increase in our aid. In the second place, some of the individual member states, which are 27 and very soon with the arrival of Croatia 28, are redirecting their aid to the most needed countries, and that's what we in fact are doing as well. So there will be more aid, but it will be more focused on the poorest of the nations.
Talking about the crisis, how does the ordinary European feel about this? Because we also did a survey. I actually was in Amsterdam a few months ago.
Great, yes.
And I had a street open mic survey with the ordinary citizen. And they complained that life had become tougher and tougher.
For many Europeans, the times since 2008 are genuinely tough, are difficult, and it will remain for some time, and in some cases for a long time. But at the same time, as you see, the European Union is taking very determined action to end this crisis. The Netherlands, for instance, which has always been a champion of aid, has reduced its aid. Not the European Union as an institution, but individual countries. So we see adaptations, and we cannot deny that.
Now, Ambassador van der Geer, let's talk about the trade pact. Third world goods exported to Europe are perceived to be just a handful, and if so, they don't quite generate a lot of money, and the opposite is true. In fact, most goods, if not all, from the so-called third world countries are considered low quality. Why is that?
Yes. That's not a correct picture at all. Let me start with South Africa, which is a bit of an exception. That's a very beautiful example. So let's start there and then go down.
Considering that South Africa is the most developed African nation, not all African nations are as developed.
Exactly. So that we should treat South Africa, but then look to others as well. A good quarter, in fact it's almost a third of South Africa's export currently is going to the European Union. It was more, but demand in the European Union went up. It's about, let's say, a quarter. Of that, well over 50% is manufactured goods, cars, chemicals, etc. Which means a direct attack on unemployment. That is also why I am very committed with the South African ambassadors in Europe, obviously, to promote trade between South Africa and the European Union. Because although I represent the European Union in South Africa, I'm also looking very much at South Africa's interest in terms of the European Union. It's a two-way flow. So in the case of South Africa, I think we have an example of what a middle-income country, an African emerging country, can do in terms of its exports. 70%, and if you compute it in another way, even more than that, of foreign direct investments in South Africa are from the European Union. And I think it is important that that is diversified. So 2 points. In the first place, South Africa has a very diversified export portfolio. Secondly, direct investments in South Africa are still predominantly from the European Union, and I think we have to diversify that. And South Africa would have to interest other countries to invest more here.
Which is what I was actually about to ask you, that what have you done, rather, to facilitate trade with other less privileged African countries?
The major instrument in trade terms at the moment is, of course, trade promotion, trade facilitation. But what we are aiming at is to reduce all the barriers to trade. in terms of tariffs and quota. And we are at the moment discussing, negotiating, I would have to say, with Africa, so-called economic partnership agreements. That has been a very long and difficult road, a very difficult road. But in the case of the Southern EPA, which is South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Namibia, probably also Mozambique and Angola, we are very advanced at the moment. We already signed EPAs in Latin America, and I think that these EPAs, which intend to open the trade even further between Africa and the European Union, are the best answer in the fight against unemployment.
Okay, now that brings me to my next question. With regards to investment opportunities in the EU for the third world in particular, what have you done to facilitate good investment, not only for European countries coming to Africa?
Yes.
Let me just explain to you how I mean. How have you improved the communities where you seek opportunities? For example, education, health, arts, especially in less privileged countries. What we see now in the Niger Delta around in Nigeria, is particularly a good example of investors that actually come, take, and go.
Yeah.
What have you done to improve that, in fact, to avoid that? Okay, now Nigerian reform policy has also been very much linked to the problems that Nigeria is facing right now. Let's talk about a little bit more about the reforms. What has the government done thus far in implementing electoral reforms, investing in basic infrastructure, resolving what we call the Niger Delta problem, the security and human rights crisis in Nigeria oil-rich delta? Now, this crisis springs from tensions between oil corporations and Nigeria's indigenous and ethnic minorities.
It has always been strange when people talk about ethnic minorities in Nigeria, because our evolution did not, assign some status to individuals or groups or communities. We're all Nigerians. This is a recent development, perhaps for people who want to use that as a platform or avenue to gain attention or to even further personal interests.
This report is bad news for Nigeria's government. It is extremely dependent on the oil sector, which accounts for more than 80% of its revenues.
Where a country or a community is disciplined, there are certain values that it rejects, and corruption is one of those. What we are experiencing now is a product of a number of accumulated issues, discipline-related issues. Okay, and so it has affected
within the government
and the society generally.
The society,
yes.
In general. Okay, now we've had in the reports and local newspapers that the increase of crude oil theft has been rampant. Major oil-producing country loses much revenue from illicit oil bunkering. But they have also gone to allege that because of the political elite and militants, they profit from such operations, which is why they have not been able to do so much to try and stop it, to try and curb it. What, in your opinion, is your take on it?
Illegal bunkering affects the industry, affects progress, especially for countries like Nigeria, where we depend so much on the revenue from oil.
From oil, that's right.
Right. Now, the extent of people involvement, government officials and others, is still being determined. The present administration has set people out on the field to try to ascertain the extent of involvement of individuals in government, with illegal bunkering. I know of recent that a number of arrests have been made around Nigerian waters involving foreigners who come around to steal crude oil. Okay, even 2 weeks ago, I think one was discovered involving some Ghanaians and other foreigners from Europe.
Multinational oil companies including Total, ExxonMobil and Chevron operate in the Delta. Most of Ogoniland's wells and pipelines are owned by a joint venture between Shell and the Nigerian firm NNPC. The UN report criticised Shell for poor maintenance of its infrastructure, which has caused leaks. This simply confirms what people here have believed for decades.
How do they gain the access? Which is where the huge question is, how then do they gain the access into the Nigerian oil fields? You're talking about foreigners here. How is it possible that somebody would come from Ghana or from elsewhere to actually penetrate?
Don't forget that oil is onshore and offshore. And so oil can occur on our territorial waters. And it is not always that, we have drilling machines all over, taking the oil from this location. So people can identify where activity is not going on at the moment and still in there because attention is not paid there.
Okay, does it mean that there's no security that has been...
Well, it's not about security. If you have a big farm and you're not cultivating one part of it and somebody steals into it, it's not about security, it's about diligence. Okay? And that is why, for now, there is security. We have, the government has provided the police, the Navy, with patrol boats, and also they are patrolling the area. Mm-hmm. And that is why, that explains the recent arrest of these illegal bunkerers on our shores. So, people who have the intention to come and steal your property are definitely more on the alert because they sit down, all they do is to plan to do that, to commit that crime. You have so many other things to do, okay? So occasionally you find people, these thieves will find access where loopholes exist. But government, again, is not resting. That is why it is fortifying and strengthening its capacity to check activities of bunkerers, illegal bunkerers in the region.
While we are very keen to invest and will continue to invest whatever happens, at the same time we also need to look why don't certain things march? What is, for instance, the diagnostics of the failing primary education situation in South Africa? So we will have to look at that. We will have to do that in other countries as well. But the truth is that education in many other African countries, in fact, is running better than in South Africa. So we will have to address that. A second very important element you raise, without mentioning it, but I feel that you raise it, is corporate social responsibility.
Absolutely.
Especially in a country like South Africa, but also in other African countries where unemployment is high. Firms should do that and should expand also and contribute to health and education and should pay their taxes, Because what we do in Europe, we don't nationalize, but we tax firms. We don't tax them to death, but we tax them. And I think that the European Union, but certainly also an institution I would like to mention here with a lot of emphasis, the European Parliament, is working on this corporate social responsibility. So the companies should be addressed, but the governments should collect their tax and use it to the benefit of their people as well. You see, it's a partnership, it's a PPP.
Now on that note, actually, it's very profound that you say that. What do you think of companies that have invested, particularly in South Africa? And yet South Africa has been grappled with ugly protests over low wages.
Yes.
Is it an area of concern? Is it something that you address?
It is, of course, an area of concern. In the first place, in South African society, the big challenges, not in terms of sectors, but of overall, are poverty, huge poverty still in this country, huge inequality. As you know, we have the highest Gini coefficient in the world, maybe not the highest, but then the second or the third, and unemployment. And if you take these three together, you have a huge problem. Now, at the one hand, many of the salaries that are paid barely allow for a decent living in South Africa.
So can we not increase them a bit?
Yes, but at the same time, these salaries are internationally considered as quite high. So the government has, at the one hand, it has to guarantee South Africa's compatibility and it should be competitive on the world market. And at the same time, it is widely felt in South Africa that the minimum wages are very low. Now take the farmers in the Western Cape.
Okay, yes.
They say, listen, there is no argument that we would like to increase our salaries. We're committed to that, but at the same time, if they reach a certain level and they're already, then we will have to cease operations. This is also what apparently the mining. So it is a challenge that is confronting the South African government, which is extremely difficult because we have in this country a government that is committed to improve living conditions and that is fully supported by the international community. At the same time, the country must remain competitive. So it is a matter of increasing productivity, again, better educated people, and balancing these things and working extremely competitive.
Ambassador, can I just ask you something while you're on that note?
Yes.
You did say that salaries are actually considered at an international stage. Now, the euro is obviously stronger than the rand.
Yes.
What is the criteria? Is
Yes.
it not actually supposed to be a reasonable amount that is comfortable for an ordinary South African citizen? Because
Absolutely.
the salaries that are there at the moment are actually very little just to live in South Africa
Yes.
and not even be put on the international
Yes.
stage.
Exactly. What you see in South Africa is that the income differences are very, very big. They're much bigger than in Europe, where maybe the top salaries, except for a few, are lower, also in the civil service, but where the lowest salaries are at a much higher level. So that's one element. The other element, as you rightly point out, is your competitivity. You are in a world. To remain competitive, your costs have to be competitive as well. Now, salary costs are just part of a wider cost picture. So, if the salaries go up, but your productivity is going up as well, you're fine because your product will still be competitive. And that, I think, is South Africa's challenge. Increase productivity per worker.
Now let's move on. Allow me to ask this. We see a prominent EU player like France intervening in a situation like Mali, what's happening in Mali at the moment. And is it actually purely out of helping, or are there some hidden interests? A lot of people have perceived that the EU or the Westerners would come into play to help an African country only because they have some hidden agenda, some interest in there. What is the situation with Mali?
Yeah. No, there are huge African interests, there are huge European interests, and they are not hidden, they are very open.
They are not selfish.
They may be selfish as well, it's our interests, and interest sometimes, but let me elaborate. In the first place, the Malian government at some stage says we will not be able to guarantee our territorial sovereignty and integrity. So we appeal on the international community for help. They appeal to the United Nations and to ECOWAS, the regional. And the response was positive but slow. So France, on the basis of its historical relations, it's a former colony of France, said we will spearhead the operation, but we refuse to do it ourselves. We will only do this in the perspective of the region taking over.
Okay, now just a quick one to round off our interview, Ambassador. Let's talk about the EU debt crisis that's going on right now.
Yes.
Should we say the euro has failed?
No.
Are there any chances of it being dissolved? Of course, some have reported that the euro has succeeded in trying to curb the debt crisis. How far true is that?
No, I think we have to take a balanced view. The crisis is not resolved, and the euro has not failed. But we are in the middle of addressing this crisis, and we need time for that. And the point with the European Union is always we grow through crisis, which is sad, but that is the case. And if you look what the European Union has done in the past 3 years in terms of improved crisis management, of overseeing and controlling the banks across the European Union, of increasing the possibilities and the capacity of Brussels to intervene in cases where things go wrong, then I feel that what we have put in place has made the euro the currency, if you like, of the future and much stronger. But let us not make any mistakes. We are still in this crisis. We are grappling with it. But as you probably see also, we are overcoming this crisis. And in fact, new countries are entering now the euro. And the eurozone will further expand. But it is clear that we launched the euro and we're expecting, in a very positive economic climate, to take the further steps to consolidate it also politically. And this crisis has hit us full in the face. We dealt with it, but it has come at a very high price, as you know, and it will take us many years to fully overcome the crisis. But I think the immediate crisis elements will be overcome in the next few years.
Ambassador Van der Geer, my last question to you is, so where do we go from here? What is the way forward?
With Africa?
Africa and the EU.
Yes. Well, as I said, we are very rapidly expanding our collaboration. South Africa is a great example, but as you also already indicated, of course, South Africa is one of the most advanced economies on the continent. So our goal over the coming years is to follow, as we say, a policy of differentiation, where our development aid will be much more concentrated on the most needy, which will automatically mean less on South Africa. We will in fact see a reduction of our development aid to South Africa, but in full agreement of the South African government, which is, as you know, establishing its own funding agency, SADSPA, the South African Development Partnership. So in fact we will become a partner with South Africa, possibly in some cases. But what I see is increased development assistance to the most needy, strongly increased cooperation in the wider political field, AU, EU, but also in the UN framework. More trade, absolutely more trade, open frontiers. I feel that President Zuma's initiative for the tripartite, East African Community, COMESA and SADC, is an initiative that we warmly welcome, which would, it's not happening tomorrow. If you look at the history of the European Union, we're building for decades and we are nowhere ready yet. So we have to be realistic, but I see an exciting future for an emerging Africa. I work in Africa since 1978, so I'm very proud of many of the things that I see. And I see a consolidating Europe that will gradually overcome its crisis, that will remain by far the biggest economic bloc in the world, and that will be Africa's neighbor and partner.
Thank you very much, sir.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time.